Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Carolin Emcke, and I'm very happy to welcome you. This is day 3 of our conference about narrating war, and we are going to talk about who decides and which conflicts deserve the attention of a global public, which are the conflicts which are being ignored and why. How do we reflect upon the media significance and importance of wars? Who decides what needs to be told? Who decides what may be told? Who is involved, and what are the motives and reasons according to which an individual decides whether he or she dedicates his or her attention to a war? What are the hierarchies we see? What are the power factors we see? Power factors which make it possible to narrate war, to talk about war, or which prevent it. We will talk with 3 personalities from very different fields. John Lee Anderson, a journalist, author, biographer, investigative reporter, who has written books which for me are among the most influential books in my own career as a journalist. He covered Central America in the 1980s. He reported from war regions: Afghanistan, Uganda, Israel, El Salvador, Iraq, Ireland, and the Lebanon. I'm very happy to have you here. Welcome. Carroll Bogert, Vice Director External Relations of Human Rights Watch from New York. Before, she was Director of Communications. That's also a topic on our agenda today. We will talk about what this means. What does it mean to organize or manage the communication for an organization which deals with human rights violations in more than 90 countries all over the world. Before, she was an international correspondent. She worked for Newsweek. She was based in China, later in Russia. Welcome, Carol. And I'm also happy to welcome General Reinhardt, who was at the NATO Joint Task Forces Center and K4. He was in Croatia, Somalia, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Welcome, General Reinhardt. John Lee Anderson, how do you decide which conflict or war you want to dedicate your attention? How do you decide which conflicts do not interest you?
Thank you. Well, it's been a kind of a long career, and I went through a long period when I was a young freelancer after starting out in Central America, where I had what I call a fever of war, which was that I wanted to know about war in all of its facets, in all of its places, in all of its varieties. And I set about doing that for about 12 years. So I chose exactly where I went. It was mostly guerrilla wars rather than formal. I was not drawn to the conventional armies who were suppressing them. I was drawn to seeing the battlefield from the side of the insurgents. This is at the end of, just before the end of the Cold War in the 80s. And so this was a period of, I guess you could say, absolute poverty and absolute freedom. I wrote a few books about it, but I was able to, nobody cared. Nobody cared exactly. Which dawned on me at a certain point, although it wasn't the issue that drew me back to war. I'll just mention a couple of those. I remember going to Uganda shortly after the current president seized power as a rebel chief in 1986. And the country was still very unsettled. There were child soldiers who were manning barricades. And with a friend, a photographer, we drove to the far northeast where we heard there was something going on. We ran into an ambush, and then the next day we heard rumors that there had been a massacre, and we went into a series of villages that had been massacred by the raiders the night before. And it was very raw. There were still people dying as we arrived, and people who had fled during the night who were coming back and who came in behind us to see that their relatives were killed. And I remember the incredible frustration of being, on the one hand, a young reporter without a name in an obscure, unstrategic part of the world, and my photographer as well. This massacre never ever even saw the light of day. It didn't even merit a wire dispatch in 1986. We couldn't even interest the wires back in Kampala, and we had photographs of people dying. We had very raw testimony of the battlefield. It was a great frustration. I always remember this moment because it seemed galling to me and appalling that this could just simply be side-stroked by history, and it was. And of course, I now know that what we saw then was the very first sort of murky violence that eventually erupted into what we now know as, through various transmutations, it became first Alice Laquina, the self-described queen of the tribes of the north, and then finally Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army, which have devastated that part of Africa for over the years since. That was a great frustration, and among a number of others. But that isn't what drew me back to war. I spent another 10 years not really going to war, but writing books about different things, mostly about conflict. And it was 9/11 that drew me back to war. And I chose to go to war because I felt that with all of my previous experience, I had something. I felt not just it wasn't it was a compulsive decision. I felt that I could say something that I had experienced that had been lost in the previous half generation from these places, that I understood the psychology of war. And in the years since then, with the New Yorker magazine, which gives me a lot of leeway, I negotiate where I go. I don't exclusively cover war, but there are wars that interest me a great deal, and I have, in some cases, had to fight to go to them, because it's difficult to explain to people why you feel compelled to go into a dangerous place, sometimes. And in other cases, it's been a mutual decision.
Wenn ich etwas... Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Bloody hell. Okay.
Wenn ich nachfragen darf,
A follow-up question, if I may.
bei dem Beispiel aus Uganda,
You gave the example of Uganda, and you said this was a place which was of no strategic relevance. I wonder, with respect to the places you choose, do you go intentionally to places or regions which are of no strategic importance because you think that people overlook these locations, because the public is rather focusing on other conflicts, i.e. conflicts which are of geostrategic relevance? So do you try to find the forgotten conflicts, first of all? Or, and that's part two of my question, do you also pick places where you, being an American, have the feeling that you share the responsibility, or a bit of the responsibility? Lawrence Weschler said in the talk we had here on the first evening of the conference that he is a citizen of the US democracy and is thus always feeling a certain responsibility because everything that happens also on his behalf. Does this matter for you too?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, no doubt. I came of age at a time when the U.S. was withdrawing from the world In a way, it was an analogous time to the present moment. It was as Vietnam drew down. My first experience as a reporter were in Central America, where the United States chose to covertly re-enter the kind of geostrategic fray. And I was the first generation of reporters who weren't embedded. There's this notion today that embedded reporters are something of the last decade. Reporters have always been embedded. It's just a new term. But my generation, a handful of mostly American but also Western European reporters, went out into the world, into the hot conflicts of the last days of the Cold War, and in some cases were antagonistic with their own governments, and tried to find a way to report an impartial truth of both sides. It was difficult to do. It's certainly disappeared, I think, from certainly a younger generation today, in the conflicts of today. But that was my mindset. And so, this isn't exactly the question you asked me, but I was trying to try to examine what led me to these places. You asked me a two-part question. Can you
the
tell me
second one was, do you feel that you have to go as an American? Do you
Yes.
feel in particular responsible, and you make those choices
Exactly.
accordingly
Yeah,
to go
yeah,
to places
yeah.
where you feel your government is involved in a
In the late
particular way?
90s, I returned to places of war. This was immediate post-Cold War, places where I felt that the United States had a huge impact in these largely obscure, neglected conflicts of the proxy wars of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, places like Angola, places like Iraq, and so forth. At the time, nobody was talking about overthrowing Saddam Hussein, but there was clearly a war brewing there. I felt as an American that we had a special responsibility to see what our influence had left behind. And in one place after the other, I found devastated landscapes, really venal political systems left in place, with the clock ticking on what would eventually happen there. Afghanistan, in fact, was on my list. I had been there in the late 80s when the Soviets were leaving with the Mujahideen, and it had been on my list for 2000, and then 2001, and so it felt logical to me to go back there after 9/11 happened. I felt it was part of this onward journey. I didn't make it in time, but I should just say that I was also going to places where I felt that we could learn by, in some cases, these so-called obscure wars where we had never had a strategic interest. Sri Lanka was one. And it was something deeply disturbing to me about Sri Lanka, which I visited with my brother in the early days of its conflict. And there was something that was genocidal about the conflict. And both of us remained deeply disturbed by what we'd seen. And over the years since, I realized that it never became more relevant to Western readers particularly. But there was a personal attachment. And about every 6 months or 8 months would go by, and I'd read in the paper randomly about yet another person we had interviewed who had been killed. To the point where in 2001, early 2001, it dawned on me that virtually everyone we had interviewed had been assassinated. And
Because of having been
just because the war was so deadly, not because we had interviewed them. No, the people we had interviewed were all dead now. And so when September 11th, 2001 came around, my plan was to go to Sri Lanka to revisit a country inhabited only by ghosts. So it sounds like a bit of an artifice. In a sense it was, but it was a real one. And I thought, this is the only way I can visit this country and make it seem relevant or interesting to Western readers. This is an obscure conflict which has lessons for us about how societies break down and how communal hatreds fester, can become part of official constructs, and vast killings can be done. I wanted to examine this more closely, and then, of course, 9/11 came along, and I didn't go for another 11 years to Sri Lanka.
If I may ask, if you would have to choose today, would you go to Kiev or the Central African Republic?
In my heart, it would be Central African Republic.
General Reinhardt,
General Reinhardt. General John Lee has just told us that there are different reasons why you focus on this or that region. It may be a personal reason because you feel attached to a country or because of a person you have talked to. Could be also a political reason because you think that the world does not look at the country, so you go there in order to tell people more about it. Now, can you tell us a bit about how arbitrary this attention for a given conflict is? So why do people focus on one conflict but don't focus on another one? What about the media attention and the relationship between the media attention and the depth, the intensity, the brutality of the conflicts and the military significance? Is it arbitrary? Well, different from John, I could not go and decide where I wanted to go, so the federal government told me where I had to go. And of course, we have to consider the parameters according to which the federal government decides. Now, let me give you 2 or 3 examples in order to tell you what it's about. Bosnia-Herzegovina. You all know the horrible pictures taken in Dubrovnik, Vukovar. Permanent attacks on Sarajevo, more than 300 days, and the population has realized, the population realized what was going on. So there was no doubt that the Bundeswehr should go there too, and Germany should participate in the NATO missions there. Kosovo is another example. People were displaced, had to flee their country, 300,000 or more. And the population, the German citizens, had the feeling that something needs to happen. This is just 1 hour away by plane. Now, let me ask you, nevertheless, imagine the same pictures of similar situations: displacement, persecution, snipers, killing people, chasing, hunting the population from other regions. Would the population here feel the same? I mean, you just said 1 hour flight. So let me repeat my question. Is there an arbitrary element involved? Is there an arbitrariness about the pictures or images we get from a certain region? Why do some affect us more than others? The personal, the feeling of being personally touched or affected plays a role, but also pictures that John and others bring us play a role, because without these images, you won't be able to decide, and you won't support the federal government that decides we go here or there. The relationship between a country and the mission is decisive, and Kazakhstan is certainly less interesting. If there were a situation similar to the Kosovo situation, then a region where we are immediately concerned. The federal chancellor returned from the United States after 9/11, and he had seen the towers, the collapsed towers, and he had tears in his eyes, and he said, we have to exercise unconditional solidarity with the Americans, and that's what many people in Germany could understand. What has come out of it within a lapse of 12 years, well, people can't understand it anymore. And for me, it was difficult to understand, and I also fought with the foreign defense minister Struck, who said, we are defending Germany at the Hindu Kush. That's absurd. But then, at the time, the chancellor was convincing, and you can see that you can get drawn into an operation which starts as a peacekeeping operation. Well, we will talk about this particular dimension later, because I would like to ask you about your personal perspective with respect to Iran and Afghanistan. But first of all, let me ask you, which are the conflicts that deserve our attention? Carroll, may I ask you the same question, more or less, that I've asked to the 2 gentlemen? How do you and Human Rights Watch, the organization, decide where to get involved? Because you know that the media public can only focus on a certain conflict or aspect to a limited extent or in a restricted dimension. So how do you decide which the situation you focus on in particular?
At Human Rights Watch, we have about 400 staff. This is not enough to cover everything that's happening in 90 countries around the world, and in fact, we would like to cover more than 90 countries around the world. At the same time, this is a bigger staff than many newspapers have now. I think we have more researchers around the world, certainly than New York Times has, probably Süddeutsche or Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung or even Der Spiegel. So we do have a significant apparatus. We are not journalists, but we have a significant information gathering apparatus around the world. And every year, tomorrow I fly back to New York and we will have our annual meetings with all of the research staff to plan. How will we spend our scarce resources? What will we cover in the coming year? So we do it according to 4 criteria. The first one is, how bad is the abuse? You know, some kind of almost physical measure. Is it 1 village? Is it 50 villages? Some sense of the severity of the human rights abuse. Second, we have to look at, do we have the capacity to cover it? Do we speak the language? Can we get access to the place? Can we get the information that we seek? The third thing is, do we have the right partners? We are always working with local NGOs who help us to get access to the victims, to find the story, to get out there and do the work. We need to have the right partners in order to accomplish what we do. And then the fourth thing is a kind of hard-to-describe element, which is the moment right? If we do it now, can we have an impact? An example would be, we were approached by a coalition of women's rights groups in Kenya a few years ago. Big problem in Kenya of widows of AIDS who could not inherit their husband's property. They wanted to change the law in Kenya. They came to Human Rights Watch because they felt that a report about this by a big international organization would help to push the issue in the parliament. In Chile some years ago, the government, we knew from conversation with government that they were ready to make a change in their laws on freedom of expression. We produced a report about this, and the next day the Prime Minister announced, the President, that they would introduce a revised version of the law. So sometimes we know through conversation with local NGOs or with governments that the moment is right.
Could you say, have you ever made a false decision? Where you retroactively said, we focused on this conflict and somewhat I don't know, I wouldn't say neglected, but would you say retroactively we should have put more pressure on this government, or we should have,
Yeah, I mean, there are many things we've worked on where we didn't have impact.
Give an example.
North Korea, have you noticed? We haven't changed North Korea yet. Really, we're trying very hard, but it hasn't happened yet. You have to be willing to fail in this business quite a lot, yeah. I would say, we devolve the decision to the researcher. We are not a centrally directed, I'm the deputy director of Human Rights Watch. I would never tell a researcher what to do. I would never direct a researcher to cover one thing or another. That researcher is expert in their country. They have forgotten more since breakfast about their country than I will ever know. We leave them the responsibility and the authority to make those decisions. But it's also true that I direct the media work at Human Rights Watch, and I want to advise them on what issues I feel are hot. What issues can we draw international attention to? What issues do I know John Lee Anderson might be ready to do a big story in the New Yorker about, which would really help push that issue on Sri Lanka? Let's talk about Sri Lanka afterwards, John.
Could you say how dependent are you? Yeah, there's many different factors that guide these decisions. As we had from John Lee, he would say, well, in some cases it's strategically totally irrelevant country and just nobody cares. As General Reinhardt said, in some countries it very, very much depends on the images, on the enormous emotional weight of acting against or with such images. Could you say how dependent you as an organization are in your campaigns on images? I'll give you an example. I remember I was staying actually with a researcher from Human Rights Watch, Joan Mariner, when the Abu Ghraib scandal broke and the New Yorker Seymour Hersh had the story, and we saw for the first time these images. And this researcher said, we discussed the story and the case and the abuse, and then she said, I wish I had such images from the countries and the conflicts and the abuses that I write about. And so, of course, that wasn't the only reaction she had, but it was clear that she felt somewhat envious about, an issue where she knew this is a possibility to morally scandalize the abuse. And she felt, in many cases, the issues that she was working on, she didn't have these images. Could you elaborate a little bit on the dependency of images for the effectiveness of the campaign, but also for the decisions that you make on what to focus on?
Yeah, huge personal preoccupation of mine. So since the Abu Ghraib, and in some respects even because of the Abu Ghraib scandal, we have now a multimedia program at Human Rights Watch. In the Central African Republic today, we have had for 3 weeks internationally known photographer Marcus Bleasdale working with our researcher, Peter Bogert, to document what's happening in this most forgotten, most obscure country of all the forgotten and obscure countries of Africa. The constant stream of imagery that he has produced from Central African Republic has actually been very, very helpful in raising attention to this conflict. And the Twitter feed that Marcus and Peter are sending out from CAR, Central African Republic, if you are interested in issues of how war is narrated, I recommend to you this Twitter feed. They are establishing a new form of war reporting from Central African Republic. So in this instance, it's incredibly expensive to keep Marcus in Central African Republic for now more than 3 weeks. He charges a day rate and travel expenses and all the rest.
Can you give us the numbers, just to give an idea of concretely how expensive that is?
Oh, I'm sure we've spent $50,000 already. I mean, maybe that doesn't sound like a lot of money to you, but for an NGO, it's a lot of money, and I have to raise that money. And it's separate from the regular budget of Human Rights Watch, and it's very expensive, but it's incredibly important. And when Peter sends out a tweet without an image, his Twitter followers tweet back at him, hey, where's the picture? People they are hungry for these images, and they have a different kind of impact. When I was an editor at Newsweek magazine, before I came to Human Rights Watch, when I was the foreign editor, we had an editorial meeting every Tuesday morning where each head of the department would go around the room and pitch, here are the stories I want to put in the magazine this week. And the highest praise that you could get from the editor-in-chief was, it's a bit of an English idiom, but he would say, nothing but readers. In other words, this will have many, many, many readers. Now, at Human Rights Watch, we have a different yardstick. I don't care how many readers. That's not the basis on which we make the decision about where we invest our time and money. It's not about how many readers. We know there are not many readers for Central African Republic. It's my job as the head of the media operation at Human Rights Watch to increase the number of readers that we have by any means possible. And photography is a critically important means. We are starting a magazine at Human Rights Watch, and our first issue is devoted entirely to the Central African Republic. When we first talked about doing this magazine, we used to joke, well, would we put Central African Republic on the cover? It was like the definition of the most obscure and unwanted topic we could think of. But we're doing it because we want more readers. We will do anything to draw more attention to this conflict.
General Reinhardt, wenn wir sprechen in einer solchen Runde über
General Reinhardt, we want to know who decides what is being narrated and who narrates and who tells us more about wars. Then, of course, hierarchies matter. Now, most of us are amateurs in this field. We don't know much. Could you please tell us how an institution like the German army, the Bundeswehr, organizes the narrations? May people just go and tell what are the criteria which are applied and who decides what is to be public and what is to remain disclosed? Now, we are dealing with international teams and staffs. It's when we are on international missions, never the Bundeswehr alone. It's always an international, a mixed team. So we cannot decide about what the Turkish public, for example, is to know. Now, media activities tend to be more important than our operative work, our operations as such, because if you overlook the public in the countries concerned, you won't get the troops and people you need. If you are depending on 30 or 40 countries to send staff, you have to convince 30 or 40 countries. If you don't convince them of the need, you won't get what you need. I had an operation group with whom I talked about the strategy for the upcoming week. On a weekly basis, we identified what are the most important aspects to touch. How do we want to talk about aspects? What are the means we have? Will we make interviews? Will we write articles? Will we get in touch with newspapers or other media? So there is a long-term plan, and then we act on the basis of the plan, and of course we coordinate our publicity activities with the media concerned, and of course then we decide about what to tell and what not to tell. But the important aspect is that we want to go public and we want to be active. We don't want to react, we want to act, because we want to convince the public in order to gain their support. And then, of course, you have to be careful. Never lie, never tell things that are not true, because they will fight back. Whatever you tell needs to be checked, double-checked. It needs to be true. Could you give us an example? An example of a case where you were in charge and then you said, we won't tell the people. Now, of course, there are cases which you don't want to talk about. Now, but I'm asking for an example. Give me an example, please. I mean, it's some time ago that you've been in this position. John Lee and I would also give examples in order to be fair, all right? Examples where we decided about something we did not want to tell. So could you tell us an example, a day you woke up and decided, this is an example, a case I won't talk about? Let me give you an example. When we were in Pristina at the airport, and we had difficulties with the Russians. Now, the Russians were in a maze in the rocks or mountains near the airport, and we could not get access. And I said, let's try and solve it internally. We won't go public here, because otherwise the conflict will get out of hand. We won't be able to solve it. Another example, another problem was Mitrovica, which has been a problem ever since, still a problem today. The French soldiers, the divided city in Kosovo. part Serb. Right, the French did not do what they had been asked to do. I tried to send the commander home, but the French Minister of Defense said, don't attack my commander, otherwise we'll opt out of the coalition. And then, of course, you have to decide, is it more important to impose your order on others, which was important for me in order to control Mitrovica, or can you lose the coalition? Can you risk the coalition, but then you don't go public, because I don't want to put any shame on the French Minister of Defense. Now, these are the more harmless cases. But maybe there was also a case where you were not in charge, and which would be an example of what we'd label the culture of silence. And the example I have in mind is Kunduz. This was about protecting the army. And could you maybe tell us how you proceed in such a case? How do you decide that you cannot simply go and admit that you've made a huge mistake? Mr. Klein, McChrystal, the I4 general, went to Kunduz the very next day, went on the spot and said, this was one of the biggest mistakes we've ever made. And he also complained about Oberst Klein, and this in public. He was very clear, and he said that he had given orders. He had said that the troops should not attack civilians at all. But Oberst Klein, I mean, that's what McChrystal said, doubted it and acted on his own behalf.
Here we've got a case where the Supreme Commander has indeed negatively considered to be these consequences of the action, and he went public immediately and said we need to check into that, and we need to have a group of people explaining to the public how all of that happened. I mean, you know much more about it than we do. Would you say that the public is familiar with the story of Kunduz, or would you say we just have half of the information? I would say it has been discussed everywhere, in parliaments, in films and everywhere, and so whoever was interested should have ample information about it. And those who are not interested, I mean, you can make as many films as possible, but if you don't want to know, you don't get to know. But I don't think we will find out anything new, because all the facts and all the information was explained. I mean, it's also a question of censorship decisions within institutions, within international institutions at that, during such a mission. And there are certain limitations to what you can tell about the war. That's one thing. And then secondly, are there any hierarchies between the ranks and who can say what? I mean, when we prepared for the meeting, there was a comment in the internet saying, well, these are not simple soldiers that are involved. Well, people thought that there's always a high-ranking representative of the armies who is narrating the story of the war, and people would believe that the rank-and-file soldiers would have a totally different story of the war. I mean, in how far do stories differ? Stories told by soldiers and by officers? Are there any hierarchies? I mean, a soldier who goes to such a mission is afraid, and a general is just as much afraid to get shot or to step on a mine, and this fear is constantly present everywhere, and this fear is also present during decision-making processes. It influences you constantly. Today we have a situation where every soldier has a mobile phone of his own. Every soldier has a PC or a tablet and can write whatever he wants. We have no censorship. Maybe NSA is a censorship in a way, because they are wiretapping everything, and would probably also be wiretapping information written or told by soldiers. But, I mean, soldiers get a briefing within which limits they can tell the story. So they have to sign an affidavit, but then they can write within the limits. What are the limits? I mean, would there be information or instruction saying that they are not to say that's a useless war? I mean, soldiers, when they convey messages using their mobile phones, they also put their own safety at risk. That's the so-called operational security they need to adhere to. Other than that, they're free to do whatever they please. They have no limitation on what they are allowed to say, and that's quite remarkable. We leave a lot of freedom to the soldiers. All of that is free. And we run the risk that we give the responsibility to the soldiers. As long as I was on active duty, I never had a situation where I had to tell a soldier, you have betrayed a secret. I mean, remember, we had a conversation, the two of us, where we talked about publication in Süddeutsche Zeitung, and then as a book, letters from Afghanistan, where the Ministry of Defense was, let's say, less than euphoric when they saw the book. So that was quite an interesting situation, because the Süddeutsche Zeitung thought, well, the army should be interested in getting to know what soldiers have to say. And the Ministry of Defense should be happy about such information getting public. I mean, then the Ministry of Defense had decided to try and keep the information secret as long as possible. I mean, for me, media work is even more relevant than active duty, active combat, because whatever you try to pull the brakes, it's always it always comes back at you. And the more transparent we are in working with the public, the more credibility and trust we will get. Letters from the front were opened once in Bundeswehr, in the German army, but then that was a misbehavior on the part of a soldier who was in charge of letters. And of course he got accused, and it's okay, we don't open letters nowadays. When you talk to the soldiers out there who'd been on active duty outside, and I've got many friends who've been on active duty, they are happy about the fact that they can have phone calls, can write letters, and have absolute freedom. Now, a question to the two of you. You as a journalist, and Carroll as a representative of Human Rights Watch, as a spokesman for the researchers. I mean, General Reinhardt is a very democratic person. Is that also true for many others in armed forces? Would you say there is transparency, permeability? Of course, it depends on the region you are, but could you say something about whether you are hindered in your work by the military, by the armed forces?
Well, if we speak about the armed forces of Western powers, that's one thing. You know, many of the places where we work, we're dealing with armed forces that are barely organized. So, you know, in the Central African Republic today, it's possible to sit
take
with
the Western.
commander.
I meant.
We definitely have dialogue with, let's say, the Pentagon. I would not say we are often seeing things in the same way. We campaign for example, the United States to sign and ratify the treaty that bans landmines. We have not achieved this over many, many years of campaigning because of the unique allergy of the US government to international law, it seems. However, it must be said that the US is mostly in compliance with the treaty, and they have spent a lot of money helping other countries to destroy their stocks of landmines. So they are not a completely evil player. It's a complicated situation. We do a lot of work on violations of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, the laws of war, documenting violations of those conventions by Western armed forces as well as rebel groups in the Central African Republic. There are lawyers in Western militaries whose job it is to be in dialogue with people like us. So how often is that a productive dialogue? No, to be fair, so we documented in Yugoslavia the use of cluster munitions in populated areas and took the results of this research to the US Air Force and said, it's ridiculous, you're using this weapon improperly, you're dropping cluster munitions in populated areas and you're killing civilians unnecessarily, which is a violation of the laws of war, and you should stop. And they said, yes, actually, you're right. And to our knowledge, the US Air Force has not used cluster munitions since that conversation. There were other parts of the American military that didn't get the memo. So we saw the US Army launching cluster munitions through artillery in Iraq and Afghanistan. We saw huge use of cluster munitions by the Israeli military in southern Lebanon. We've hardly won the battle. But there do exist lawyers in defense ministries with whom it's possible to have a conversation. It's a separate question whether the politicians listen to their lawyers.
John Lee, could you also say how much was your work, constrained or hindered or censored by, in this case, I mean, we're talking about Western armies?
In my case, very little, because I usually worked on my own. I've done as little embedded reporting as possible, perhaps to my detriment. I mean, it's a valid form of reporting, to see the way one's own troops operate in a foreign country. In most cases, Iraq, Afghanistan, I'm thinking of, my experience predated the American involvement, so I tried to continue as much as possible reporting what I saw from the perspective of that society, albeit as an American in that society, with my country's troops there. I have tried to extract information from the American military. I have accompanied them on operations. But it's different, the relationship between the military, which is now a very big, sophisticated bureaucracy, sophisticated in some ways and incredibly clumsy in others, is different to that, say, it would be with a human rights organization. In some ways, while you have lawyers you deal with, Carroll, we have, public relations people who, in some cases, regard themselves as journalists as well. They've worked for the Stars and Stripes, which is the army newspaper, or whatever. And effectively, they're there to try to assist you within their constraints and within their brief, which is to make sure that their armed institution gets the best possible play in whatever medium you work for. And it's a kind of cat and mouse game. There are journalists, of course, who play it much closer, and others who are more questioning and challenging. I approach the U.S. Army like I do any large institution. It's the same. It's the kind of corporate structure where it's self-contained. It seeks to see the best possible image. Whether or not that's the truth is beside the point. I haven't had, I can't say I've had constraints put on me because I've done so little of it. I've rarely ever gotten anything of real interest out of the military, and in general I shy away from it, just as I do the U.S. embassies, because increasingly in the last, say, 10 or 12 years, the U.S. government behaves much like the former Soviet Union did, which was to say that, everything is off the record. Private interviews are viewed by them as opportunities to exchange information rather than impart it.
The former Soviet Union did not give interviews off the record. I'm sorry, I was a reporter there.
No, hang on.
You cannot make that analogy with a straight face. You mean that they are very controlling of information.
That's what I was going to go on to say.
But the Soviet Union was quite impervious, really. I was a reporter there for 5 years. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, in my experience, the U.S. government has gone increasingly officious, increasingly restrictive.
Yep.
So to the point...
Due to the war on terror? Or is that the Patriots
yes,
Act? Or?
Yes, to the point where...
The blast wall around the embassy.
To the point where you can no longer simply go in and have a conversation, let's say, with the ambassador. It needs to be approved in Washington. And I guess that's what I mean, never having reported in the Soviet Union, but having seen the kind of wall that it seemed to put up, I've seen my own government become increasingly like my image of what the Soviet Union was. For instance, I was just in Nicaragua, not a country at war. I tried to see the American ambassador there, and I couldn't. And I was told by the public affairs officer at the embassy that, you know, I'm pretty experienced in this stuff, and I know when it's going quickly through the machinery in Washington and when it isn't. And this one isn't. And I thought to myself, this is the U.S. government.
Yeah.
As a result, as a U.S. citizen working for the New Yorker, I went into a country, a fairly low-level, diplomatic representation, and I was unable to get even a face-to-face with the ambassador in that country. That's kind of what I mean.
I've just come back from Guantanamo Bay, where part of the strategy of the U.S. military there, I felt, was to wrap you completely in cotton wadding of nice. They are so polite. They are so polite as they tell you that you can't walk over there. There is a culture really of extreme politesse that is part of the protective wadding around what they don't want you to see. It's a very surreal environment in Guantanamo, where it's beautiful and sunshiny, and there's the wonderful blue sea there, and would you like to rent a boat? And,
Get away from...
But the whole, everywhere, the omnipresent and invisible issue of Guantanamo is torture. It's the ugliest history of America, and it's being kept from the courtroom, and no one wants to talk about it. They want you to go to the beach. And it's a very surreal environment.
Could you talk a little bit more on that? I was curious and wanted to ask, how actually the real legality of censoring the report on torture or on human rights violation has developed since the Patriots Act. Could you elaborate a little bit on what sort of the legal frame is that actually hinders to write about or describe the human rights violations implicated in the war on terror?
Well, a lot of information has come out, and there is much more to be known. The battle we fight right now is, the Senate Intelligence Committee has produced a huge report about how torture was used by the U.S. government in the war on terror, and it's being suppressed. So we want simply that the U.S. government own report about this ugly history be made public, but the CIA doesn't want that to happen. In the trial of the 5 accused September 11 suspects that is preparing now in Guantanamo Bay, the rules of the military commission have changed. So Obama did do this. It is no longer possible to submit evidence in that trial that was derived by torturing the suspects. However, it is still possible to admit evidence in those trials that comes from other people who might have been tortured. So there are little ugly loopholes scattered throughout the system. As far as we know, torture is not part of the state policy of the U.S. government at the current time. That's something Obama said on his second day in office. We won't use these techniques again. The question now is how to compel the American government to come clean, to say openly and fully what happened, so that we can establish, first of all, that it must never happen again, and second of all, in our view, what's even more difficult, prosecutions for the torturers. They committed war crimes. The use of torture in the conduct of war is a war crime, for which people should be judged, and very high-ranking people. This is not a popular thing to say in the United States, but we still say it.
Can I ask... Kann ich General Reinhardt als Militär fragen?
General Reinhardt, may I ask you as a military man, when you see Carroll Bogert's demand that those generals, those high-ranking soldiers, should be put on trial. Absolutely, I agree. I feel very angry when I think of Guantanamo. That is precisely what we don't want to do. We don't defend a situation where we try to help other countries. And back home, we put people in jail in an unfair trial after unfair trials. I do not accept, I don't know what want to accept something like that. I've seen similar things in Somalia where Aidid was being chased and the Americans used their Delta Force and sent them to Mogadishu, and they were trying to get him, and there was this famous day, this Black Hawk Down in a film, where all American superiors were there, and that they should have been put in jail because we gave them information. We knew what Aidid was, that he wants to turn himself in, but they said, we're not interested. We want to get this guy here and now. I mean, that is an example of cruelty, the ignorance vis-à-vis human rights. One thing is stupidity, another thing is cruelty.
Wenn Sie mit amerikanischen
Whenever you're talking to American colleagues, i.e. military from the US, are there any kind of discussions like this, with American military, etc., and can you agree that these people should be indicted, should be taken to a war tribunal, or do they shake their head? Or, well, you can talk with the Americans about this.
Wir sind überhaupt nicht damit einverstanden, was da läuft, und sind der Meinung, dass es der falsche
But I think this is the wrong approach. I mean, actually, Bayram, all these who have been sent to the Afghan government. Are you a small dissident group? No, not a dissident group, but I think I never came across anyone in areas in which I was active who agreed in any way with Guantanamo Bay. I mean, John Lee, question to you. So we had various types of censorship, or let's put it this way, control of war. We talked about conditions according to which, somebody decides what can be narrated, what cannot be narrated. But we didn't discuss up to now whether we as journalists, as reporters, embedded reporters, are also autonomous and can make autonomous decisions and say, no, I should not be telling about this, I don't want to be telling about this. Is there any kind of self-censorship? And maybe can you give us an example? Let me give you one example from my own experience, just to kind of, And in the meantime, maybe you can think whether there was something similar. I was in northern Iraq just briefly before the war broke out in 2003, and I researched concerning the situation of the Kurds before there was military deployment, before anybody had an idea that they would. And I experienced people from Kurds who were terribly afraid because they were afraid that Saddam Hussein would be using gas again, and who, on the one hand, were despaired and combating their own traumas, and at the same time they wanted to get that war, they wanted to get that deployment because they finally wanted to topple the regime of Saddam Hussein. So they were like in two minds about it. And we did some research on that for 2 weeks, and we were actually left with the impression that there was a, despaired and frightened, scared population. We wanted to write about them, and 2 weeks after that, one of those Kurds said, do you want to join us? We want to go for a picnic. Do you want to come? And we didn't know what picnic was about. We thought, okay, sounds nice, let's go. And we went there for that picnic with our Kurdish acquaintances. There were 20,000 people at the dam, and that was a party, like a big party, like a barbecue. And a photographer who was here yesterday, Sebastian Budesch, said, oh, forget that story. I mean, that's population in despair. We're going to write a story. The Kurds are like the people from Cologne. It's like Mardi Gras in Cologne. It's like carnival. And that sounds funny, but I decided, no, I can't do that. It's not on. I can't justify this in front of myself. And I said, if I go and write a story, on the eve of a war, And I didn't know how disastrous it would become, but I had an inkling that it would be very disastrous. And on that eve, if I write a story concerning Kurds which celebrate dance, party, etc., and there's lots of different images along with the disparate Kurdish population and also refugees. Of course, were also around. There was an editing room, by the way. That was the Der Spiegel, and I know which would be on the title page. So if we had a title page of partying Kurdish population, then that would be on the title page of Der Spiegel. And I decided to not write that story. So that's on the note of self-censorship. So that's about 10 years ago. And I'm brazen enough to attempt to kind of describe both the despair, the disaster, the anguish, and also the mood. At the same time, describe the mood on that very special day where you celebrate. I think back then I took the wrong decision. I think I didn't trust my own skills. I think narrating war also includes narrating the absurd, the bizarre, the strange stories. Could you give us one example from your own experience? I mean, it doesn't have to be a funny experience or, hilarious note. It can be a brutal or disastrous note where you decided to embark on that.
I never ran across any picnics. But your reaction sounds more like that of someone who was very much in love with the cause or in deep sympathy with the people you were with, which is, I think, something you see in a lot of usually young, but not only young reporters who come to conflict for the first time. I saw this amongst, and even now, there's many, many, many young journalists out there who covered the Arab Spring who, I think, believe themselves to be journalists and actually were activists. They feel very much the cause that they're covering. And there was a kind of, I remember in Libya, kind of an assumption that of black and white, Gaddafi evil, these people wonderful. And very few reported on these bearded jihadis who we saw every day coming past the young Tahrir Square guys with the iPods and the fancy Italian jeans who were doing a kind of performance at war on the road and going to the front and actually doing the fighting, and who ultimately, to some extent anyway, have been the arbiters of Libya's destiny since Gaddafi's death. I'm speaking about the bearded guys. There's this kind of surprise, but it had a lot to do with, I think, the inexperience of the people covering the war, and the emotion of this kind, the drama of apparent revolution. I was thinking about back to embedding when you were talking at the beginning of your question. You see, I think the Pentagon, for instance, has, I'll see if I can get to an anecdote myself, but I think the Pentagon has found and other armies that embed reporters amongst them have found a very genial device to deal with the press, which was so antagonistic before. There was no real system in the time I was cutting my teeth as a journalist in Central America. There is now a system where you sign a piece of paper merely saying that you're not going to reveal the identities of dead soldiers or wounded before the army has had a chance to inform their parents or their families, which is absolutely fair enough. And the other is that you won't reveal information that could be somehow used by the enemy in the field of battle. In other words, you wouldn't send out a dispatch saying, sort of, here we are, to the snipers on the other side, which is, again, fair enough. But something happens in war when you're embedded with your own troops in a foreign and hostile environment where, by and large, you have no cultural affinity, no linguistic relationship with the local population. And nowadays, you're in what were yesterday's Jeeps are now 17-ton armored trucks where you and I would have to speak through microphones to each other inside. And you can see the explosions, but you can't hear them. There's that much, glass. You tend to be sympathetic to the people protecting you. You tend to be sympathetic to the people of your own side. You tend to feel sympathy with these young soldiers who are taking you around and have been told by the colonel to don't let anything happen to the reporter, and could be your son's age. This is the sort of the most, that's why I say it's a genial form of
censorship. It's the
of-
smartest
it's a
form of
genius-
censorship is to embed the
Yes.
journalists.
And
so
I
that
know
they
I have
cannot-
many friends who, in Iraq, I'm thinking of Iraq particularly, whom I know because we go back many years, who, I stayed in Baghdad for the invasion. I didn't go with the American troops. So I saw what I saw. And I saw surreal things like people sitting down in lawn chairs having tea in the midst of shock and awe. The absurdity of war, that kind of thing. People walking their dogs, things like that. I don't know what that says, but it's a feature of maybe shock of war. But I have friends who came up with the Americans on that road from Kuwait and who saw them, in some cases, shoot up and kill the occupants in cars, and who didn't report it, and in some cases who didn't take photographs. And they told me about it, bothered by what they'd seen, but they were so overwhelmed by the experience, and I think so convinced of a kind of apocalyptic evil on the other side that they simply shelved it. Now, having said that, there are hallmark examples through that war of reporters who did break that code. I'm thinking of, yes, I mean, there's many examples, and who went ahead and divulged the information they saw because they felt it was incumbent on them, or because they thought it was a good picture. But, I don't know, I personally don't recall...
You mean you don't make choices?
I make choices about what I report, sure.
Yeah. Okay, and can you
But that's about framing a story, I suppose. You have to choose what you're writing about at a given moment. So, for instance, in the week before the Americans attacked Iraq, I had been there for several weeks, and each week I was trying to find a story that I felt was original, that was timely, that was hopefully incisive, and that would still be valid when it came out in the following Monday. And so, for instance, in the prelude to the American invasion of Iraq, I was in Baghdad, and I found myself looking into the past, to the past invasions, and trying to assess, because I was in a kind of monolithic society where nobody would speak. They were terrified of Saddam Hussein and what was about to happen. I went to the British cemetery. I tried to talk to people about that previous invasion and about people's sense of the past and their own history. And it gave me an opportunity to talk to people in different ways. There was one thing that happened, now that you mention it, during that week, which I didn't mention in a report, but it had to do with protecting the person. The guy that was my driver suddenly burst into tears after we'd visited the British cemetery in a cafe, which is highly unusual. He burst into tears. By the way, he worked for the Mukhabarat. He worked for the secret police. His job was to inform on me, but we'd established some kind of rapport anyway. We liked each other. And but I didn't really know his truth. Suddenly, in this moment, I saw him just overwhelmed with tears. This is 4 or 5 days before the invasion happened. And I said, his name was Sabah. I said, Sabah, what is it? And he immediately composed himself. He was desperate to compose himself so that nobody see. He was uncontrollably weeping for a moment. And then he confessed that he had not heard of his younger brother for 20 years, and that the cemetery had brought it back to him, and that he believed he'd been murdered by Saddam. This was the first indication in a 3-year relationship I had that he was not completely on point with Saddam. This was the first indication I'd ever had that he had an independent thought. Until that point, it was all intuitive. And it turned into, of course, a very dramatic story later on. He composed himself again and didn't speak of it until afterwards.
And you did not write about that? I mean, that's
I didn't write about it at that moment because it would have cost him his life.
Yeah.
It would have cost him his life. It was a tactical choice.
A lot of stuff you can't say because of security. I think your example is an interesting one because it's also about trusting trusting yourself as a writer and also trusting your readers.
Yes.
That they can see the contraindication in your story, the example that doesn't fit your overall
Yes.
narrative, but still
Yes.
be able to understand your narrative. And we face an interesting thing now at Human Rights Watch, now that we are making the works of journalism that there are no longer journalists there to make because they all lost their jobs in the United States. So we're making the multimedia pieces, that are going on television. And we find often that what our researchers are doing in the field is making a criminal file. They're collecting evidence of crime. So they need 40 testimonies about one form of abuse so that they can show there's a pattern here and it's widespread and systematic, et cetera. And that's very powerful. That's what we need in our reports in order to bring evidence of crime. When you come to the end of the process and you're ready to publish your report and we say, okay, now we're going to make a multimedia piece about this, hopefully we've had the conversation a little earlier, but sometimes we haven't, and we discover that in all of these 150 people that they spoke to, they don't have really one fully complete story of one human being. Mm-hmm. Interesting that we begin from the human experience. What is the human experience of suffering of human rights abuse? That's what's motivating us, and we're talking to people all the time. But because of our methodology, which is to produce evidence of crime, sometimes at the end we don't have the full story of the person, and we have to say to the researcher, go back, I want to know, where did that person grow up? Tell me their story. What were they doing when the rebels knocked on the door? Were they cooking potatoes? What is the real picture of that human and of their human experience that's like a vertically integrated story instead of the horizontally integrated criminal file that we're used to compiling?
Yeah, but that's a good example because it leads me to the question of what kind of sort of aesthetic conventions are somewhat guiding the narrative of war. And I remember an example that I was in Gaza in the hospital and I saw burn victims. And I wrote an article and my editor called me and said, we cannot publish this. It's unbearable. It's unbearable. And there was a long discussion about, how accurate, should it be? Do you want people to stop reading, or do you want to make people feel sick? And I said, I want them to feel sick. And maybe they stop reading at that passage, but at least they've read that passage. Do you have such discussions also about?
Yeah.
Because it's always to give other people an account of what war or human rights violation is about is always a process of translation. Yes. You always translate either your own experience of something you've witnessed to somebody who hasn't made that same experience. Or you translate somebody else's experience to an audience whom you want to get engaged or involved. So can you describe a little bit if you have such discussions?
Yeah, so I find it actually a very beautiful thing how our researchers take the incredibly complex experience they have in the field and shrink it to the Human Rights Watch report. So I was in Congo, in Eastern Congo, with our Congo researcher some years ago at the beginning of a research project about gold, how gold was being mined and sold to benefit rebel commanders who were using it to perpetuate the war, and international companies were benefiting and helping to fuel the civil war in Congo. It took her about 3 years to produce this incredibly complicated product, and I went with her from village to village talking to people who were terrified. And Eastern Congo is extremely complicated. There are many different rebel groups, each with different initials, and many people who have never really told their story to anyone before because no one cares. And then when her report came out, I was on an airplane somewhere, and I opened it up and began to read it. And I'm a hardened human rights activist, but I started to cry. Because to see all of those difficult stories reduced to something tangible and hard that was going to change the situation. It was like it had come through this vast sieve and been turned into a weapon of change. And I think the language of Human Rights Watch is in some ways intentionally boring. Our success lies in our dispassion. We are not screaming and crying and waving our arms around and saying, oh, it's really bad, you have to do something. You know, we're lawyers who speak in these very calm tones about evidence of human rights abuse and legal obligations of governments to take a different policy. And I think that helps us in the conversations that we have with government officials, which are the secret to stopping human rights abuse. You don't stop it without being able to have those conversations. But now, because of the technology of communication, we speak in many different ways. We translate that report. First of all, we translate it also into Arabic and French and Spanish and Russian and Chinese, but also we translate it into tweets, and we translate it into dispatches, and we translate it into video, and we translate it into every possible format on every possible platform, so that one body of information exists like a tree with many different branches. And that means now that we speak in more styles and more different kinds of language and with a different aesthetic in a way.
I'm glad you said the last part, because I would have said I don't really buy it that it's Human Rights Watch always sounds totally distant, because I would also say maybe in the language of the texts. But evidently, if you have a video footage, if you have a multimedia production, you've been very, very active and very offensive. I mean, positively offensive in that. I'm guessing, but I'm sure that the level of donations you receive for particular programs very much depends also on not just the imagery, but also the language in which you present a certain area. I mean, just the way General Reinhardt described the decision of the military or the politicians to go into an area or not, I would say, I assume the donors of Human Rights Watch...
The videos are very popular with the donors of Human Rights Watch. This is true.
Okay. And
that's life. We accept no government money. We have an annual budget of $70 million US. We have to find every year $70 million from private individuals and foundations to fund our work. So no question, being able to speak to them in a language that is not boring and not legal is something we must do, or we don't survive.
One last question for the three of you, and then I would like to open discussion to the audience and ask questions. For each of you, maybe we start with General Reinhardt. How did social media change the perception of war, and also change the way who decides on what can be told about war?
I cannot really answer this question because I'm missing the experience with the social media. By the time I was still on active duty, this is 13 years ago, these social media didn't exist. I only can guess, but I don't want to guess because it's not based on own experience. Mm-hmm. But I would like to, jetzt bin ich, I'm sorry.
Sprichst auf Deutsch?
Okay, I can continue in German, but I'd like to get back to the war crimes. So we described war crimes in a situation where we thought we can make a difference. By Carle de Pante, we were asked, the head of ICTY, we were asked to look for mass graves and excavate them. And as a general, you don't sleep for days if you went to these mass graves. And we were in a situation where we were in the Serbs were encircled by Albanians who were on the outskirts, surrounding them, and it was being said, well, amongst these Serbs there are Russians who killed our people. 1, 2, 1, 2. So we were asked to look for the perpetrators. So we were asked to go to mass graves, and as a general, you can't sleep for days if you went to these mass graves. And we got legal scholars to get in. And we tried to find out who were the people who perpetrated those mass murders, and I think they did a fairly good job. We passed on all the documentation to ICTY, and Carolin Ponte was initially very positive concerning what we reported to her, but the negative aspect here is that none of these cases was taken to court. Actually, all of this was relegated to the scrap heap of history, and all of these endeavors, apart from excavating the death bodies, were completely in vain. And this is incredibly frustrating, because essentially you try to, help in this situation. What we could do is that those who were encircled in Oravats could be liberated by pressurizing the Albanians to an extent where we said, if you don't release them, we're going to close the schools and we're going to close the hospitals. This is the only way in which we can put our foot down, so we could release them, but they could release them. But, I mean, it's really frustrating, and say, okay, we've got the respective evidence, and then they go unpunished. So I think the frustration is definitely...
I think the frustration is something that you probably share.
Yes? Yeah. Frustration is a hallmark of our work. If I could say something about social media.
Yes, yeah? I want to.
So, absolutely transformative. Democratization of the means of communication. I'm a former foreign correspondent. All my friends are former foreign correspondents. Emphasis on former, So I spend a lot of time sitting with my friends moaning about how bad things are, and there's no money anymore, and people are losing their jobs. I'm not being facetious, it's really bad. A lot of great people lose their jobs. It's much worse in America than it is in Germany, by the way.
We're also complaining.
You have some problems too, but believe me, it's worse. So I was having a lunch one time with the producer of 60 Minutes, which is like the big investigative television show in America. It's actually a really good show, and he was a really good producer, and we were having this sad conversation about he didn't have so much budget. And, I had a moment where I said, I'm sorry, David, but the same internet that's killing you and losing you advertising, good for me. Mm-hmm. I don't have to kiss your ass anymore to get Human Rights Watch on TV. We have our own YouTube channel. We made a video about homophobia in Russia 2 weeks ago. It has 3 million views on YouTube. It went viral. I don't need the mainstream media always to get the information out. We have 1 million people following Human Rights Watch on Twitter. It's a pretty good-sized audience. Now, the mainstream media still amplify greatly, what we can do, and not every general we want to reach in the German Bundeswehr is following Human Rights Watch on Twitter, so it's important that we're in Süddeutsche Zeitung, because
Absolutely.
Maybe he'll read it there. Yeah. So, but it's just diversified the channels that we have for reaching the public. And in some ways, it's cheap. Twitter is cheap.
Yeah.
I'm curious in what way the stories that we hear about war are stories told by a certain class or certain gender or certain race, and in which way the social media, have they transformed that? Have they changed that class issue or gender issue or race issue, or is it only sort of perpetuated now in a different instrumentarium?
So many questions in that one question. Most of the people who work for Human Rights Watch are women. So I don't know if there's a gender voice in our narration of war. It's hard for me to say. Mm-hmm. Human Rights Watch is an elite institution in a way. We're not even a mass membership organization like Amnesty International. We're not really involved in engaging the public from top to bottom in human rights issues. We're engaged in reporting them, communicating them, and then advocating with governments about them. And that tends actually to be a fairly small circle of our researchers, reporters who write about it, and policymakers who do their jobs. So I think most of the people who work at Human Rights Watch are not American, and I would say there is great penetration of communications technology, sometimes even in very small villages in Africa. Everyone has a cell phone, even when they don't have some other very basic things. So the potential for a more democratic array of voices on issues is now there. Whether the potential is realized yet, I'm not sure.
John Lee, you're very, very active on Twitter. I'm following you all the time. Can you say a little bit how the social media has for you transformed your own way of either perceiving or narrating war?
Well, I still think of myself as the sort of writer of long-form pieces, but not only that now. While, I mean, I agree with Carol's comments and this idea or observations that it's both the thing that helps you and the thing that kills you, you know, social media. I began, like most writers, resenting it intensely, having to sort of get on Facebook or having to finally get on Twitter, these sort of things. I still sort of resent Facebook and ignore it mostly, but Twitter I found about 2 years ago in Syria, it finally clicked for me what its power was. And it's, and until that time I had tweeted sort of vaguely thinking, pushed by the 20-somethings in the web room of the New Yorker to do it. But I didn't really know why I was doing it. I didn't really understand what was the point of this, you know. I remember I tweeted, my first tweet was a picture of a soccer game in newly independent South Sudan, but only because I was figured out how to do it, you know. That's all.
It was unintentional?
No, I sort of did it. I thought, oh wow, I managed to do this. I tweeted a picture, wow. And, you know, it's like sending up a smoke signal without really knowing why you've done it, which is, I think, what Twitter is. It's smoke signals. Yeah, it alerts people over there that there's something here. And you know, there's a link and you can read it, possibly. A picture is always good, I find. But what happened in Syria to finally make me decide to use it more was I visited, this is just when the rebels arrived in the outskirts of Damascus. I was on a regime visa, but I went with a couple of with friends to a town that was under siege by the army. The army didn't want us to go there, but we went anyway. When we got there, the army decided to start firing tanks at us. And as the day went on, and at the people in the village. There were civilians there. There were also fighters there, terrorists. We were watching television, and we could see that, and we began receiving calls. And it became clear as the afternoon went on, as the tank fire got closer, buildings next to us, people wounded, that kind of thing, that they were planning to really, this was a first in the war, so to speak. This is long before Aleppo and all of that. I realized that they were going to possibly pulverize the place. I called a foreign ministry official to let him know that we were there. He was furious. I was there with a New York Times reporter that we were there.
He was furious that you were there?
Oh, he was furious that we were there. I said, look, your people are hitting this town and there are civilians here and we're here. He says, the terrorists are there. And I said, no, there's also civilians here. And I took pictures with my iPhone of the people in the room, which included a woman, a child, a baby, and others. And there were others around. Anyway, long story short, he agreed to get the regime to cease fire for 30 minutes for us to leave. And as we left, and we did, just before night fell, and then there was, you know, a hostile roadblock, and we could see dozens of tanks coming up. They were going to flatten this place. And eventually they did, and killed the people we were with. But when I got back to Damascus, and I've got Wi-Fi in the hotel, I thought about it, and I decided I would tweet a picture, which included a picture of the civilian woman and child in the room. And I carefully chose the words that accompanied it. I said, Syrian civilians and FSA fighters in the besieged town of Rankus on the outskirts of Damascus 2 hours ago, something like that, or today. Well, at the time, it was a matter of media speculation what was going on there. And the minute this tweet went out, it went into this hyperactive superheated cycle of media interest, of all of the interest groups and so on. And it just went briefly, for a few hours, as they say, viral. And suddenly thousands of people were following me, and there was a lot of acrimony about it. Initially, I was attacked for having revealed the face of a civilian by pro-rebel groups. And I couldn't say anything because, of course, I had done this subversively. I had wanted, it was my way of saying, without saying, get the regime to stop. It was my way of saying, there are civilians there, not only terrorists. I've seen them with my own eyes, here's the picture. And I decided just to hold my tongue because I was still in Damascus. And after, half an hour or so, there were other people rebuking that first person for suggesting that by pointing out exactly my intention. Long story short, I then began to tweet more often. I still am not entirely sure of its ultimate value, but it's an undeniable fact of life and what it allows one to do, which I didn't have the opportunity to do before, which is to weigh in more immediately in places of conflict.
Like in comparison to your Uganda example
exactly.
that you begin with,
No, exactly.
closes the circle. I mean,
And
when
what
you
Carroll's-
said no news wire cared
That's right.
about that massacre,
No,
never
and
ever
what Carroll
saw
said
the
about
light.
the democratization of the public space is absolutely true. If Twitter had been around in 1986, or social media, and I'd had the means to overcome my obscurity as an irrelevant freelancer in an irrelevant country, someone out there would have noticed that those people had just been massacred. And nowadays, we have a surfeit of that. We still have political, I think, a lack of political will necessarily to always come in time. They're always the cavalry that come too late. But we do have this new means now to alert people to what's going on.
Unfortunately, I have to be democratic too, and there's many more questions that I have. I feel we just touched the issues, but I would like to invite the audience to also ask questions. There's a microphone. You have to wait. Yes, you have to wait for the microphone because otherwise the translators cannot translate you. You would need to use the headphones. Sie können auf Deutsch oder auf Englisch sprechen.
You may ask your questions in English or German, but be so nice and wait until they give you a microphone. I have worked for over 10 years for ARD, and I worked for ARD and ZDF, for a public broadcasting station. I worked as a reporter for 10 years in all these wars in the 90s. What you haven't spoken about is the decision of TV makers. It always depends on whether people want to see. The ratings are being counted every minute, and as soon as the decision makers see that news coverage just get 5% and other programs get 10%, it's very difficult for you to get your message into the media. That's very important. And secondly, when do we cover? When do we report? When do we not report? I mean, how do TV stations make a decision where to place reporter? In Africa and Kenya, we just have one. South Africa, only occasionally reporters are there. Then we've got one in Egypt, and he's supposed to cover the Egyptian, the Arab space. I mean, I used to work as a freelancer, and if there is an official reporter, They wouldn't even take your material as a freelancer because the editor-in-chief would always give preference to his employee unless you have the better story. I was one of the first in Sarajevo, and there the question was, what are we going to show? We were the first. ZDF did not have a reporter who dared to go down to Sarajevo. And so every day we had our 20 or 30 casualties that we reported just as numbers, but then that gets boring for the audience. And they say, well, at the moment we don't want to show any hospitals. We do have some national news that come first. Okay, the next day you try to get your report into the media. Then you see, well, again, 30 casualties per day, that's not interesting. 1,000 grenades per day, that's no more interest in that. And then all of a sudden, a shell exploded in the market square of Sarajevo. 40, 50 people dead simultaneously with one single shell, with one single grenade. That, again, made news. Well, we didn't have the pictures, so we got the pictures. But do you have a question? Yes, we got the pictures from another massacre which has taken place in parallel. And then CNN had the time to make a big story. And so the next day when this story arrived and the Americans placed this story, then the Minister of Defense, who was in Sarajevo, started taking action. And then because CNN had started reporting, the German media started reporting more widely as well. My question comes now. You have said Guantanamo, that is something that makes you very angry. I mean, would you be willing and ready to talk about that publicly so that Germans can relate to Guantanamo? I mean, would you perhaps start a public action in order to get Guantanamo into the media once again? And then the editors-in-chief would be interesting at that, because it's a problem for us reporters. Our editors block sometimes the news. I don't have a problem saying it publicly. I said it publicly that I get angry when I think of Guantanamo. I am not willing and ready to start a campaign because I don't think if I started a campaign with a couple of German journalists, I could do something. If a president in his own country fails, and President Obama has said he wants to stop Guantanamo, if he can't make it happen, I don't think we as Germans could achieve anything. That would be wishful thinking, I guess. Would you please wait for the mic, please? A question that came to my mind during the during the discussion is the question of political power and the differences between institutions. We've talked about journalists, human rights organizations, and political power structures like armies, armed forces. I mean, these are different spaces, and sometimes it seems as if we had a common space, all of them, the armed forces, the German armed forces, who needs, of course, the support of the people. Can you give me an assessment where do you think you are? What is your relationship to those different spaces? Do you see yourself as powerful or not powerful? What is your position? What do you think is your position in those kind of different power structures?
Power as a journalist, and then maybe you as a human.
Question for everyone.
For everyone, yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Well, more now than I did before, but it's very mitigated by. Well, certainly thinking back to the Iraq War and the conflict in Afghanistan, which has gone on for so long, you know, I think I am not a cynic. I no longer feel, I mean, I know that there are reporters who feel a kind of existential despair that whatever you write, nothing's going to change. That's not true. I was in Iraq when Sy Hersh's photographs came out about Abu Ghraib. It had a fundamental impact on the nature of the war and the political discourse. There are, periodically, sadly, what the other bookmarked his career, My Lai massacre at the very beginning, came too late to obviously save any people. It was certainly an important story in terms of the American internal discourse, if nothing else. I think, it's somehow haphazard. You can be very lucky at times and be powerful as someone in the media. You can help inform, you can help, you can add to the debate, weekly and daily debate. You can even help mold it. I mean, there are certain commentators who are very, very influential. So it's a mixed bag. How much power does one have? I don't really think about that very much. I hope that sometimes I move people's thinking away from manifold, deterministic ways of looking at the world. If I have a kind of a personal raison d'etre when I write, especially about conflict, it's that. It's for my countrymen, my readers, not to fall into that easiest of behaviors, which is to view the people in that other place in some objectified way, as black and white, as gooks, as hajis, as whatever, killable, easily objectified. That's usually, I think, somewhere inside of me. If there's a little missionary impulse, that's probably it. When I'm out there seeing everything firsthand, I don't want people in powerful places to think of people in vulnerable places as easily dispensed with. And so it's usually that's about as highfalutin as my pretensions go. And sometimes I feel reciprocated by reactions. But that's about as much as I could say. Yeah.
General Reinhardt, können Sie...
In NATO, we have a term, comprehensive approach, and it says that all the forces that are in a country should work together, should create a synergetic effects in order to use the financial and HR resources sparingly and for the best possible success. This strategy is absolutely correct, but is hardly ever used, because everybody works in a way separately. We have to say as soldiers that in such a mission we always play second role. That's a fact. The first role is played by the aid organizations, the state-run organizations and the NGOs. They know how to support, and everything a soldier can do is protect them externally so that these aid organizations can work fully. Unfortunately, we receive much more money for the military and much less for civilian reconstruction, and that is an imbalance that we see. And we produce this imbalance, and in spite of all the attempts of the American president, we haven't been able to balance expenditure for civilian and military purposes. I mean, you can talk for a long time about why this is the case, but the interests of the various groups are usually so separate that we do not have a dovetailing, we do not have sufficient interaction, and that's a big problem. And I think as long as we let the civilian and military area work side by side without linking them, we will not get the success that we should get, since we spend such a lot of money. I mean, we have paid 17 million from Germany to Afghanistan. The Americans are over 700 million. What do we get there? What is the effect of our action? It is not the effect we want to have, given all the financial investment. I mean, you've also asked about political power and how the institutions relate to one another. I would have thought you would say, I wish we had more political power, because I know that during your last two missions, in Afghanistan and in Iraq. You were very critical. I must say I come from a generation that still believes, or used to believe at least, that soldiers always want to go to those places. But I've learned that not everyone is just hot to have a fight. You have politically advised Germany not to go to those places. And so I think you would have thought, I wish we had more power, because we would be much more critical as expert in military affairs. No, it's not necessary for the military to have more political power. The military has the opportunity to inform politicians, to provide guidance and counseling, and this is huge. And of course, consultancy must be accepted. There are some people who resist any kind of advice, don't listen. I mean, if the military had more political power, that also would lead to some kind of an imbalance I do not wish to have. In the years 92, 93, when I went to the first Somalia mission until my retirement, I never had the feeling that I don't get heard, that I don't have a say. I never had a feeling I need more political power. The political power that we have is absolutely sufficient in order to implement our missions. And together with a civilian leader in Kosovo, that was Verma Kushner, and I could collaborate with him and get the best possible success. Carol, maybe you will take the floor and also talk about the political power and the relationship of the diverse actors that we have.
Yeah, so I speak from the perspective of civil society, and we are used to thinking of ourselves as we have nothing. We have to beg for money. We have to beg reporters to write stories about us. We have to beg governments to meet with us. We're always in a position of asking for something on the basis of not having money or power in society. But, you know, to be honest, I've had some experiences that have caused me to rethink that self-image. I was in Dublin at the final negotiation for the treaty on cluster munitions, and I spoke there with the New Zealand ambassador, and he said something very interesting. We had worked for many years on cluster munitions. I told you already we did reports from Yugoslavia and also southern Lebanon, many different places. We had people very expert in the weapon. And this guy from New Zealand said, you know, we're New Zealand. We're good guys. We don't have cluster munitions. When I get in a very difficult conversation with the German ambassador here about the Z7X/9H cluster bomb, I have no idea what he's talking about. And I don't have anyone in Wellington whom I can call to ask, because our defense ministry doesn't have cluster munitions. So I asked Human Rights Watch. I think we're used to thinking of like governments are the repository of expertise and authority, but actually civil society is sometimes more expert in some things. Mm-hmm. And he said also, you know, New Zealand wants to be like very active on the world stage. They're very active in UN. They want to be good guys in the world. And he said, you know, when we are looking for the next topic that New Zealand will grab and try to move diplomatically in the world, we look to civil society. Governments don't innovate. Governments don't have new ideas. Civil society puts issues on the agenda. You push for this cluster munitions treaty. Civil society makes the Disabilities Convention. Civil society writes the Convention on Disappearances. The energy for positive change in the international arena comes from civil society, and sometimes also the expertise on it comes from civil society. And I think that's new.
Ja, vielen Dank. Vielen Dank alle drei. Vielen Dank John Lee Anderson, Carroll, Bogert und General Reinhardt.
Thank you all.